In the autumn of 1867, in the river town of Harwick, Kansas, there was a brewery that had not brewed anything in 6 years. The building still stood on the low bank of the Neosho River, 2 stories of hand-laid limestone with a cedar shake roof gone silver with age. The Harwick Brewing Company had been a modest enterprise before the war, producing perhaps 40 barrels of amber lager in a good year, selling to the saloons and the boarding house and the wagon camp outfitters who came through the river road. The man who built it, a German immigrant named Ernst Holter, had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1861, a few weeks before his son Caleb rode east to join a Kansas infantry regiment. Caleb Holter did not come back. The brewery sat. By 1867, the town had mostly stopped looking at it. A place can become invisible when enough years pass and no one claims it. When the weeds take the loading dock and the pigeons colonize the upper loft and the limestone goes dark with river damp. What the town noticed was the debt attached to it. Ernst Holter had borrowed $412 from the Harwick Savings and Loan in 1859 to expand the cellar and add a second fermentation room. The note had never been paid. The loan had passed through the hands of a loan officer named Pierce, who had died in 1863, and then to the bank's new director, a man named Gerald Solt, who was not from Harwick and had no particular feeling for what the brewery had been. He wanted the property sold and the debt cleared. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in late October, on the limestone front step of the brewery itself, with the Neosho running brown and cold 40 yards to the east and a wind out of the north that smelled of early winter. There were 9 people present, counting the auctioneer. Nora Holter was one of them. She was 26 years old, the niece of Ernst by marriage rather than blood, which was why she had no legal claim to the property and why she had spent the previous 18 months working in the kitchen of the Harwick boarding house to save what she could. She had arrived in Harwick in the spring of 1866 with $41, a canvas-wrapped bundle of her late uncle's tools, and a knowledge of brewing that most people in the county did not know she possessed. Ernst Holter had begun teaching her when she was 11, during the summers she spent at the brewery while her mother worked the harvest circuit. He had no daughter of his own, and Nora had shown an aptitude that surprised even him, an instinct for the chemistry of malt and water and yeast, a patience with the slow work of fermentation, a sense of when a barrel was ready and when it was not. He had taught her to read a hydrometer, to test the specific gravity of a wort, to identify by smell the difference between a healthy secondary fermentation and one turning to vinegar. He had taught her, above all else, to keep records. The 9 people on the step did not know any of this. What they saw was a slight young woman in a cream floral dress and a red wool shawl standing at the back of the group, her dark auburn hair pinned up under a cloth bonnet, her hands folded in front of her. When the auctioneer opened the bidding at $30, she let the others go first. A cattle buyer named Harmon made a bid of $35. A man who ran a feed supply offered $40. When the bidding stalled at $48 and the auctioneer began counting down, Nora said, clearly and without looking up from the ground, $52. The cattle buyer laughed. The auctioneer blinked. When no one else bid, he brought down his gavel. She had paid for the building, the equipment, the cellar, and everything in it. She had not yet been inside. If you have ever wondered what remains in a building that has stood empty for 6 years, stay with this story. What she found in that cellar changed more than her own life. It changed the record of what had happened to this town and to a family that had trusted the wrong man with its future. The front door had not been forced. Someone had kept a key, or had access to one, because the iron padlock was intact and the limestone sill was undisturbed. Nora used the spare key from the auctioneer and let herself in alone the following morning, before the boarding house kitchen opened. before the river light had fully risen over the eastern bank. The ground floor held the brewhouse proper. 2 copper kettles, green with oxidation, still connected to their wood-fired furnaces by iron flue pipes. A hand-operated grain mill fixed to a central post. 3 long wooden fermentation troughs, dried and cracked from years without moisture, and a sorting table near the north window where the hops had been weighed and the malt graded. She walked slowly through it, touching nothing, learning it the way her uncle had taught her to learn any new space, with her eyes first, her hands second, her nose third. The room smelled of old grain and river damp, and something sweeter beneath, the faint ghost of hops from the last batch brewed here before the war. The stairs to the cellar were at the back of the building, behind a heavy oak door that swung on its own weight and came to rest standing open. The cellar itself ran the full length of the ground floor, cut into the riverbank limestone, and was cooler than the air outside by perhaps 10 degrees even in October. The walls wept faintly with seepage. The floor was packed earth. 8 wooden cradles ran the length of the room, each built to hold 3 barrels on their sides, and 6 of them were empty. The 7th held 2 barrels, their iron hoops gone orange with rust, the wood of their staves checked and dry. The 8th cradle, at the far end of the room near the north wall, held 1 barrel. Nora stood in the door at the top of the stairs and looked at the room for a long time before she went down. The barrel at the far end was different from the other 2. She understood this before she reached it. The other 2 had the look of abandoned stock. The wood had contracted with years of dryness, and when she tapped them with her knuckle, she heard the hollow knock of empty vessels. The 3rd barrel, the one at the north wall, did not sound hollow. The tap was dense, muffled, the sound of something that still held its contents. The iron hoops were rust orange like the others, but the head of the barrel, the circular face of it, was sealed differently. Instead of the standard boong, someone had driven a wooden plug into the boong hole and sealed it over with a thick coat of dark wax, the kind used to preserve a long-term storage barrel against air infiltration. Her uncle had taught her that technique. It was used when a brewer intended a barrel to sit undisturbed for years, not months. She rested her palm on the head of the barrel and held it there. The wax seal was still intact. No one had opened it. She went back upstairs, back to the boarding house, and worked her morning shift in the kitchen without saying anything to anyone. That afternoon, she returned to the cellar with her uncle's tools. Ernst Holter had been a precise and systematic craftsman, and his tools reflected that care. The canvas bundle Nora had carried from his farm in Missouri held a coopering mallet with a hickory handle worn smooth at the grip, 2 boong extractors of different diameters, a curved iron hoop driver, a hydrometer in its original wooden case, and a small leather notebook. The notebook was the most important item in the bundle. Ernst had used it to record every batch he had brewed, every barrel he had filled, every sale and every debt, in a hand so fine and compressed that it was almost difficult to read in poor light. Nora knew the notebook well. She had been the one who taught herself to read his German script, working through it over many evenings in 1866, memorizing the inventory he had last recorded in the summer of 1861, before illness took him. She knew what the cellar was supposed to contain. She knew what had been filled, what had been sold, and what had been left behind. She had come to the auction not by accident. Ernst's notebook recorded 8 barrels of lager put down in March of 1861, designated for extended lagering through the summer and autumn. Of those 8, 4 had been sold to a sutler who supplied a military camp near Fort Scott before the war came and disrupted the river traffic. The other 4 were logged as remaining in the cellar. 1 barrel, the last entry in the notebook, was annotated differently from the others. Beside its coopering mark, a hand-stamped double circle that Ernst used to distinguish his own personal reserve stock, he had written 3 words in German that Nora had read so many times she could recite them without opening the book. Not yet ready. The barrel at the north wall bore a faint double circle stamp on its upper stave, nearly obscured by the bloom of rust on the iron hoop above it. She set her tools on the earthen floor and lit the tin lantern she had brought from the boarding house. There is a particular kind of patience required in coopering work, a patience that is physical rather than merely mental, the patience of a body that has learned to work slowly in order to avoid mistakes that cannot be undone. Ernst had spent 3 summers teaching Nora that patience, beginning the summer she was 12 years old, and had asked to help him change the iron hoops on a leaking stave barrel. He had set her down on the cellar floor with a hoop driver and a mallet, and told her to tap, not strike. A tap, he had said, is a question. A strike is a demand. The barrel will answer a question. She had been tapping since then. She brought that patience to bear now. She examined the wax seal with the lantern held close, tracing its circumference with her fingertip to find any crack or failure. The wax was hard, but not brittle, which meant the cellar's consistent cool temperature had preserved it against the freeze-thaw cycling that would have made it crumble. She worked her way around the full diameter, perhaps 11 inches, taking her time. She found one small crack near the top, less than an inch, sealed with a secondary coat applied over the primary. The secondary coat was slightly darker in color and had been applied with a narrower brush. Someone had come back. Someone had checked the seal and reinforced it after the first coat was down, returned to this cellar in the years after Ernst's death, and pressed a brush into fresh wax and drawn it across the crack. She sat back on her heels and thought about that. The reinforced seal was not the action of a person who did not care about the barrel. It was the action of someone who understood what a failed seal would mean: air infiltration, oxidation, the slow ruin of years of patient lagering. Someone had come down here with a lamp and a brush and a pot of wax and had made sure the thing would last. It was an act of maintenance, and maintenance was a form of love in a brewer's language. She stayed crouched on the earthen floor for a long while before she reached for the tools. Then she fitted the smaller bung extractor to the plug, seated the mallet against its head, and began to work the plug free with slow, quarter-turn taps, not driving it, persuading it. The plug had been seated for 6 years in the cold and the damp, and it resisted her steadily for the first several minutes, giving nothing. She did not increase her force. She changed her angle by a fraction, reseated the extractor, and continued asking. The plug moved a 1/16 of an inch, then held. She tapped again. The 1/16 became an 1/8. The mallet handle had the particular smooth weight of a tool that had been used by many hands over many years, and she could feel through it the precise moment when the grip of the wax changed, the adhesion loosening incrementally around the plug's circumference as the extractor's threads bit in, and the slow rotation worked against the seal. Her uncle had drilled into her that impatience at this stage was the one thing that could ruin everything, because a forced plug could split the head, and a split head meant a ruined barrel and no way to know what had been inside. The smell that came out when the plug finally broke its seal was extraordinary. Even through 6 years of stillness, even through the lantern smoke and the cellar damp, it was immediately recognizable to anyone who knew lager, the faint sweet malt under a clean mineral note, and beneath that a yeasty depth that meant the barrel had continued a very slow secondary fermentation across those years in the cold cellar, consuming the last sugars, clarifying itself, resting. It was not what her uncle had called drinkable. It was what he had called finished. He had told her once that a lager given enough time and cold and stillness would arrive at a state of equilibrium, a kind of completion that no amount of craft could accelerate. You waited for it, or you did not have it at all. She set the plug aside, fitted the hydrometer's tube to the bunghole, and drew a sample. She was not expecting what the hydrometer told her. She read the scale twice to be certain, holding the lantern directly overhead, because the number that the float indicated corresponded to a specific gravity that meant the lager had fermented completely dry. Every fermentable sugar consumed, and the resulting alcohol content was substantially higher than a standard table lager. This was not an accident of neglect, not something that had happened to the barrel because no one was watching. Ernst had calculated for this. He had selected a malt bill that would produce a high initial, specific gravity, had pitched enough yeast to eat through every fermentable molecule, had chosen the one position in the cellar where the temperature remained most stable across the seasons. The cellar at the north wall stayed between 40 and 44 degrees, even in the warmest months. She had measured it herself over several afternoons. It was the ideal lagering temperature, and it was exactly what the yeast would have needed to work completely without ever stalling from cold or rushing from heat. Her uncle had engineered this. He had put down a barrel of high-gravity lager in the spring of 1861, calculated that it would take several years to finish completely, sealed it so that no one would open it prematurely, and reinforced the seal when the waiting stretched longer than he had planned. He had brewed with the certainty that his son would return, and with the forethought of a man who did not know precisely when. She understood, holding the hydrometer in the lantern light, that she was looking at an act of faith made in glass and wood and wax. The leather notebook was in her satchel. She drew it out and turned to the last entry, reading it again in the lantern light. Below the annotation, not yet ready, in a different ink, written at a different time, were 4 letters she had not fully deciphered until this moment. For C. For Caleb. Ernst Holter had brewed his son a barrel of lager in the spring of 1861, lagered it through the summer, sealed it in the autumn, and left it in the cellar to wait for the war to end and his son to come home. He had sealed it so that no one else would open it, reinforced the wax when Caleb's letters had stopped coming and the waiting stretched into years, and then he had died before the thing was resolved, leaving the barrel in the cellar and the dead on the building, and no one to say what was held inside or why. She sat on the earthen floor with the notebook open in her lap and the lantern burning beside her for a long time. There was nothing to be done with the feeling of it in that moment except to hold it and wait for it to settle. The way you waited for a fermentation to clarify, because some things could not be rushed into resolution and only became clear with stillness. Ernst had known that. He had built the knowledge into the barrel at the north wall, into the patience of the sealed wax and the slow cold chemistry of the cellar. The lager was finished and ready. There was no one left to drink it. She was not certain how long she had been in the cellar when she heard the footstep on the stair above her. The man who came down was old, perhaps 70, with a white beard and the slow, careful walk of someone whose knees gave him trouble on stairs. He wore a heavy wool coat and carried no light of his own. He had followed hers. He stopped at the base of the stairs and looked at her, and at the barrel, and at the tools laid out on the earthen floor. "I thought someone would be down here when the building sold," he said. His name was August Feder, and he had been Ernst Holter's partner in the original brewery operation until 1858, when they had disagreed over the expansion loan, and August had bought out his share for $110 and gone to run a dry goods store on the main street. He had not spoken to Ernst in the years before Ernst's death. He had not been inside this building since 1858. "You knew the barrel was here," Nora said. "Ernst told me about it before we stopped speaking," August said. He sat down heavily on the bottom step. He told me he was laying down a special batch for Caleb, something that would keep, something worth keeping. He was quiet for a moment. I never told anyone. I thought it was Ernst's business. Nora looked at the barrel, then at the old man. Did you know about the debt? August's expression did not change, but he looked at the floor. I knew about the debt. What she needed was in the courthouse. She spent the next 3 days at the county land office and the Harwick Savings and Loan, not asking questions but reading documents. She had learned early in life that the people who kept records were not naturally suspicious of a woman who wanted to read them. Suspicion came when you asked for something that had to be fetched, not when you sat quietly at a table and worked through a file that was already in front of you. Gerald Solt had been cooperative in the way that administrators are cooperative when a transaction has completed, and they see no further need for scrutiny. He had given her access to the original loan file as part of the property transfer. He had handed it to her with the manner of a man who expected her to glance at it and set it down. She did not set it down. The loan file for Ernst Holter's 1859 expansion note ran to 11 pages, and Nora read all 11 pages at the loan office table with a lamp burning beside her and a piece of paper on which she copied figures in her own hand. She worked slowly, checking each page twice before setting it down and moving to the next. The file smelled of old paper and the particular dry mustiness of documents that had been stored in a filing cabinet rather than in open air, a smell she associated with the county deed office in Missouri, where she had spent an afternoon 2 years earlier trying to understand her own family's land situation. She had not found what she hoped for then. She found more than she hoped for now. The original note was for $412 at 8% annual interest, with repayment in quarterly installments beginning January 1860. The records showed that Ernst had made 3 payments before his illness in 1861, totaling $78 and reducing the principal to $334. What the file showed next was what made Nora sit very still and read the page again without moving her eyes from it. A 4th payment, dated October 1862, in the amount of $100, listed as received by the bank's loan officer, a man named Pierce, and a 5th payment, dated April 1863, also $100, same notation. Neither payment was recorded in the bank's own ledger, which she had also read, working through it the previous day with the assistance of a young clerk who had not asked why she wanted to see a general payment ledger from 6 years prior, and had simply set it in front of her and returned to his own work. Both payment slips bore a stamp that did not match the bank's standard form stamp, which she had compared to the other documents in the file. The stamp on those 2 slips was slightly smaller, the ink marginally lighter, the font of the date numerals subtly different from the stamps on Ernst's 3 authenticated payments. $200 had been paid on Ernst Holter's loan after he was dead, and his son was at war, paid by someone who was not Ernst, not Caleb, and not recorded in the bank's own accounts. She copied both slips in their entirety, including the stamp dimensions as best she could render them in pencil. August Fetter had not told her about the payments. When she came to him at his dry goods store the following evening and set the copied figures on his counter, he looked at them for a long time without speaking. "It was your money," Nora said, not an accusation, a statement of what she had reasoned out from the records. Ernst was a stubborn man, August said at last. He would not have taken it from me directly. We were not speaking. He smoothed the paper with the edge of his hand. Pierce was willing to note it as 2 payments. I did not look too closely at how he was noting it. "The slips do not match the bank's forms," Nora said. August's face went still. "No," he said. "I didn't know that." "The money went somewhere," she said. The principal did not change by $200 in the bank's ledger. The debt Gerald Solt foreclosed on was $334, not $134. She watched the old man work through the arithmetic. Pierce had been dead for 4 years. Solt had arrived at the bank in 1864 and inherited a set of records that included a debt of $334 on a derelict brewery and 2 payment receipts in a file that did not match the bank's own numbers. Whether Solt had noticed the discrepancy and said nothing, or simply had not looked closely enough to see it, Nora could not know. What she knew was that $200 had passed from August Vedder's hands to Pierce's hands and had not arrived where it was intended, and that the debt had been foreclosed on at a figure that did not account for it. She took the copies to the county clerk the next morning. The county clerk, a careful, methodical man named Franklin who wore spectacles and kept his files in strict alphabetical order, read them twice without speaking. Then he removed his spectacles, cleaned them on his vest, replaced them, and read them once more. He said that he would need to compare the originals and that she should leave her copied figures with him, and that he could not say how long the comparison would take. She told him she was not in a hurry. She meant it. It took 11 days. The result was a formal notation in the county records, recording that the Holter Brewery debt had been overstated at the time of foreclosure, owing to 2 payments received by Bank Officer Pierce and not credited to the principal. The corrected outstanding balance at the time of Ernst Holter's death was $134. The building had been auctioned to recover a debt of $334. Nora had paid $52 for a property she had in fact overpaid for, relative to the legitimate debt. She did not pursue a refund. She did not demand that anyone be named publicly. She asked Franklin if the correction would stand in the county record, and he told her it would stand. Solt was not in his office on the day the corrected filing was logged, and he did not return to it the following morning. By the end of that week, the word at the bank was that he had left Harwick. Where he had gone was not Nora's concern. The record now said what it should say, and the bank now had a problem with its own accounts that was not hers to solve. August Vedder paid her a visit at the brewery 2 weeks after the filing, walking down from his dry goods store in the cold November air. She was in the cellar when she heard him on the stairs, and she set down the cooper's hammer and waited. He stood in the door of the cellar and looked around it with the expression of a man returning to a place he had once known well. Then he looked at the barrel at the north wall, which Nora had replugged with a new cedar bung, sealed over with fresh wax. The hydrometer and the leather notebook were on the wooden shelf she had built against the east wall. "What will you do with it?" he said. "I am going to find out if there is a grave marker," she said. "If there is, I will pour it there." August was quiet for a moment. "And if there is not one?" "Then I will find a place that mattered to him, one that his father knew about." August looked at the barrel for a while longer. Then he said, "There is a bend in the Neosho, about a mile south of town, where Ernst used to fish on Sunday mornings before the church started. Caleb used to go with him when he was a boy." He paused. "Ernst showed it to me once. I do not know if anyone else knew about it." Nora nodded. She picked up her cooper's hammer from the earthen floor and set it on the shelf beside the hydrometer. "There is something else," August said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I have been to the bank this morning. I told them I wish to pay off the remaining balance on the Holter note, the corrected balance of $134, as a debt of my own." He set the paper on the shelf. "It is paid. The note is discharged. The property is yours without debt if you want it." Nora did not say thank you, because in this she recognized something that did not require thanks. A debt August Vedder had owed to Ernst Holter for the better part of a decade finally settled in the only way that remained open to him. She understood the difference between a gift and a reckoning. "I want it," she said. She spent the winter repairing the brewery. Some tasks she did alone, and some she hired out to the men in town who knew stonework and timber work. The limestone walls were structurally sound. It was the roof that needed replacing. 3 sections of cedar shake gone soft with rot, which she had relayed in January by a crew from the next town over, who asked no questions and charged a fair rate. She spent those days on the ground, handing shakes up to the men on the scaffolding and stacking the rotted ones in the yard for burning, the cold working through her gloves and her wool shawl both. When the new cedar was down, she walked the roof line herself, testing the new work at the joints before she paid the crew. The upper loft where the pigeons had colonized took 3 days to clear. She did it alone, with a broom and a shovel and a wheelbarrow, removing what the pigeons had left and scrubbing the loft floor with lye soap and cold water before it could be used for grain storage. It was not pleasant work. It was work that needed doing, and she preferred doing it herself to explaining what she needed done. The copper kettles needed descaling, which she did herself over the course of 2 weeks with vinegar and a long-handled brush, working in the cold of the brewhouse, with her breath making small clouds in the air, and the vinegar smell sharp enough to sting the eyes. The outer surfaces had gone a deep verdigris green across their shoulders and upper walls, the copper entirely obscured in the worst areas, but the interior surfaces were in better condition than she had expected, the residual bitterness of the last hops batch having left an acidic environment that slowed the copper's deterioration. She worked the brush in circles, rinsing with clean water drawn from the river in buckets, and by the end of the 2nd week, both kettles showed their original copper orange at the base of the bowl, the descaled metal bright and warm in the brewhouse light. The fermentation troughs were a loss. The staving had checked and split beyond repair, and she had 2 new ones made by a carpenter in Harwick from white oak, which was not what her uncle would have chosen, but which was sound and tight. The grain mill she oiled and adjusted and set running again on a cold February afternoon, the millstones turning for the first time in 6 years. The sound of them filling the empty brewhouse like a question being answered. She ran a small batch of barley through to test the grind setting, caught the cracked grain in a cloth below the chute, and stood in the brewhouse doorway eating a handful of it, feeling its texture between her teeth, deciding that the gap between the stones was almost right and could be closed by half a turn of the adjustment screw. She closed it. She ran another test batch. The grind was correct. The first batch she brewed was in March of 1868, 1 year after she had taken possession of the building. She did not pretend it was her uncle's lager. She had her own style, developed from his teaching but different in its approach. She preferred a darker malt base and a longer boil, which gave the beer a deeper color and a slightly roasted character that was not the Holter House style, but was distinctly hers. The first batch took 11 days from the grain in to the barrel, which was standard, and she spent those 11 days in the brewhouse for most of the daylight hours and several hours after dark, monitoring the fermentation through a glass tube she had ordered from a supply house in Kansas City, and that had arrived by river freight 6 days before she needed it. The yeast she had cultivated from a small crockery starter she had kept alive in the boarding house kitchen for the better part of a year, feeding it weekly with a spoonful of barley sugar and watching it with the attentiveness of a person tending something that mattered. Her uncle's notebook was propped open on the sorting table while she brewed. She did not follow its recipes, but she consulted it for the ambient temperatures he had recorded, the fermentation times, the notes on the particular behavior of the Neosho River water in different seasons, its mineral content shifting subtly from spring snowmelt to summer low water to autumn rain-fed. Ernst had been meticulous about water. Nora was equally meticulous. She filled 42 barrels that first year, distributed to the 3 saloons and the boarding house, and eventually to the wagon camp outfitters on the River Road, who had been buying from a supplier in Emporia and were glad to have something local again. The boarding house owner, a woman named Clara Birch, who had employed Nora in her kitchen for 18 months, came to the brewery in May of 1868 to discuss the arrangement, sat down with Nora at the sorting table, and conducted the conversation as between two women who had worked in the same building and knew what work cost and what it was worth. They agreed on a price per barrel that was fair to both of them. Clara did not express surprise at what Nora had accomplished, because she had known for 2 years what Nora was capable of, and she said so. The town noticed. Some of them said so to her directly, and some of them said it to each other, and it reached her second hand. There was a quality of slight embarrassment in how some of the men discussed it, the embarrassed quality of a person who made a judgment quickly and now had to live with what the evidence said about that judgment. Nora did not find this entertaining. She found it simply accurate. The evidence had been there, in the building, in the notebook, in what she knew, and the only question had been whether she would be given the time to demonstrate it. And she had bought that time with $52 and 18 months of kitchen wages. The cattle buyer, Harmon, came to the brewery in April of 1868, ostensibly to discuss a bulk purchase for a cattle camp supply run, and spent some of the conversation looking around the brew house with the expression of a man reassessing an estimate he had made without enough information. Nora discussed the bulk purchase with him and did not discuss anything else. In the spring of that year, when the Neo show ran clear after the winter melt, she took the barrel from the cellar and loaded it onto the brewery's small wagon. She drove it south along the river road alone, with the mare from the boarding house stable, which the owner had offered to her for the afternoon without being asked. She found the bend August Vedder had described without difficulty, a wide, shallow curve in the river where the current slowed and the cottonwood trees grew thick along the bank, their roots knuckled into the limestone shelf at the water's edge. She drove the wagon down to the bank and unhitched the mare and let her graze. She removed the bung from the barrel herself with her uncle's smaller extractor and held the barrel on its side and poured it into the river slowly, the lager running clear amber in the spring light, the smell of it carrying down the bank on the cold air. She poured all of it. It took longer than she expected. When the barrel was empty, she set it upright on the limestone shelf at the river's edge and looked at the water. The amber color was already dispersed and gone, the river carrying it away south toward the main channel. Her uncle's notebook was in her satchel. She had brought it along without quite knowing why, and now she understood. There were 2 blank pages at the back of the book after his last entry. She took out her own pencil and wrote the date at the top of the first blank page. Below that she wrote in English because her German was approximate, and her uncle would not have minded. A brief entry: barrel at North Wall. Brewed spring 1861 by Ernst Holter for his son. Poured at the Cottonwood Bend, Neosho River, spring 1868, by Nora. She put the notebook back in the satchel. It is a small thing, a notation in a private ledger. It does not appear in any county record or any newspaper account. The Harwick Brewing Company resumed operation in the spring of 1868 and continued for 31 years under Nora Holter's direction, producing a dark amber lager that was known in 4 counties by the turn of the century, and that she eventually taught 2 women from Harwick to brew after her, so that the knowledge would not leave when she did. She was not famous for what she had uncovered in the cellar, or for the corrected filing in the county record. She was known for the beer. That notebook, the one with Ernst Holter's compressed German script and Nora's single English entry at the back, passed eventually to the Harwick County Historical Society in 1912, donated by the estate of a woman who had worked in the brewery in its final years. and who understood that the notebook was the beginning of something, not merely the record of it. What do you preserve when the people who built it are gone? Drop a word in the comments below if this story reached you. And if you have stayed this far, there is another story from the frontier that kept its silence for a long time and gave up its truth to someone patient enough to look. It is waiting for you when you are ready. The empty barrel stood at the Cottonwood Bend through the afternoon, and the river went on south, and the mare grazed in the grass along the bank, and the day stayed cold and clear and held its light longer than expected, as spring days in Kansas sometimes do when the worst of winter is finally past and the land remembers what it is capable of.